To już teraz oficjalnie kłaniam się. Dzień dobry, witam serdecznie
Now officially, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to you at this beautiful venue, the Senators' Hall at the Wawel Royal Castle. It's the 1st of October, but the second day of our conference. John Paul II, Inspiration for the World. We are very grateful for the words that the Reverend told us during the Mass. And hopefully the knowledge from today's conference will stay with us for a long time. And I do hope that all those of you who have seen the beautiful paintings at the Sukiennica cloth hall in Kraków, that they also felt the spirit of John Paul II.
One nie były niczym, one były konkretne, one były bardzo mocno sprofilowane wokół tego wszystkiego, co tutaj też się dzieje i to myślę jest dowód na to, że ten kongres jest poniekąd chyba
I believe it's a proof
taką częścią
that
może nie tyle
this
narodowych, co naszych
Congress
wspólnych rekolekcji Janopawłowych.
part of
Więc dziękuję za te słowa też,
national
proszę Państwa, żeby traktować ten
teaching
kolejne
about
otwarcie.
John Paul
I w tym
II.
miejscu chciałbym też przypomnieć, że jesteśmy tutaj dzięki Fundacji
We are here thanks to the Foundation Poland, the Great Projekt, and the Foundation for the Victims of the Communism. Thank you very much.
Nie byłoby nas dzisiaj, drodzy Państwo, gdyby nie partnerzy PKO BP, totalizator sportowy.
We are also grateful to our partners PKO, Bank Polski, Totalizator Sportowy, Polish National Foundation, Fundacja ARP, PGE Fundacja, and Orlen. Our media partners are Polish Television, Kraków Radio, IPL, w polityce.pl, gość niedzielny Weekly, wszystko co najważniejsze magazyn and deliberatio.eu. Ahead of us are two new panels and the panel that will sum up the whole Congress. Then we'll have lunch and then all of us will depart. Let's start with the first panel. What was the revolution of solidarity and how to continue with? The panel is going to be hosted by Mr. Michał Łuczewski, a sociologist, Vice President of the Poland, the Great Projekt Foundation.
O pobranie słuchawek, ale też moja znów prośba, żeby później te słuchawki oddać.
If you need interpretation, please take headsets, and once the conference is over, please return them back.
An eminent scholar, practitioner, a friend of Poland, I would say most importantly, and maybe even a friend of the world, so not only of Poland. And let me invite a friend of mine, Father Oleh Kindiy, who celebrated Mass today. He's not only a friend of Poland, of the world, but he's also a friend of mine. So that's probably the most important thing for me, because I cherish that friendship for many years. We have opportunity to collaborate for more than a decade together. And I'm starting on a personal note. I was watching you, Oleh, how you were running today to celebrate the Mass. And then I was reminded that many years ago, when we were organizing Integral Leadership Central European Summer Schools, we always wanted to celebrate Mass at the Wawel Cathedral. And we have eventually did it. I'm so grateful for that moment, seeing you just here at that most important place for Polish spirituality, the heart of Krakow, the heart of Poland, the heart of Central Eastern Europe. So I was moved just looking at you, how fast you ran to be there, to be there in time. And on your robe, on your festive robe, there was a small detail. Maybe you haven't seen that small detail. But that was a detail, on the one hand, coat of arms of John Paul II and map of Ukraine, inscribed in the cross, a little small detail. And I would like to start with that small detail.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be in this very particular place. And the robes, the church robes that I wear, is one of the relics that my parish cherishes a lot, because it was the year of 2001 that John Paul II visited Ukraine, and this was an awakening moment for the whole country. John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, he visited Kyiv and also visited Lviv. And in Lviv, a lot of people, they say that more than 800,000 Ukrainians gathered together at that liturgy, which people say that in history, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom was celebrated in en masse, so many people, precisely at that place. And so for that particular event, of course, for all the priests, these special robes were designed. I was there at the liturgy as a young man. I did not celebrate it from that side. I was the one listening to the words of John Paul II and participating in the liturgy. And now this was my great privilege to be able to wear it in Krakow, where this sign of the John Paul II's noble and Episcopalian sign came from. So these symbols came together, and in that respect, this is a great opportunity to thank once again, to the people of Poland. How back then, in early 2000s, and even before that, we as two nations worked together, we collaborated, we were like brothers, and like brothers who in a family sometimes fight and sometimes reconcile, like in a good family. And this is today that great moment of unity, despite all of the differences in history and visions. We have been able to come together and, well, show to the whole world that truth matters, facts matter, as it was explicitly said yesterday, and will be repeated today, that symbols, the philosophers say that symbols are the places where two different realities meet, sometimes in a very paradoxical way. Jesus is a meeting point between divine and human. A church is a place where, invisible world and visible world meet, where history, the present and the past, and even the future meet together. And today, Ukraine and Poland and the whole world is united in the fight against, let me put it bluntly, in the fight against evil. Maybe this is too drastic, maybe too dramatic, but it's Ukrainian me speaking on behalf of a lot of people who've suffered, the evil in this present day and do suffer on a daily basis so far. Yeah.
Is solidarity such a symbol? It's still the question to Oleh. Is solidarity such a symbol where some different realities meet for you?
Solidarity, you may know that this term was extensively used by the communist regime, the solidarity of the workers. And what John Paul II did with the term, he gave it a new Christian meaning. Solidarity in the communist and context meant working together by force, from above. So somebody tells you what you have to do. And what John Paul II gave us a meaning of solidarity, that it's the understanding of working together based on recognition of your own dignity and the dignity of the other person, and realizing that very often the other person needs help, needs my support, needs my prayer, needs my friendship. So that's what happened, I think, in Poland, the solidarity from below. And this is what happened in Ukraine, solidarity from below, when people found the best in themselves to help each other and to put all the differences language differences, sometimes ideological differences behind. And the most important thing is not just to save lives, but to transform the way of thinking. I think that's the most important thing. One of the quotes that I love from John Paul II, when he said, he was asked, what is it to be a Polish? We've been asking this question yesterday and today. And one of the definitions, he said, that to be Polish is to be converted. And when I heard this quote, I realized that, well, this is exactly what we Ukrainians need. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? What does it mean to be an American or anybody else? Is to convert from your selfish, very often immature way of life into an enlightened, I apologize for this term, but enlightened by the Holy Spirit, enlightened by the teachings of the church, sometimes enlightened by the concepts of dignity and rule of law and transparency, democracy, all of these terms that we cherish today, that kind of conversion. So when we go through this transformed solidarity, then the fruits are abundant. You know, that you have a new quality of relationships, you have new reality of a government, of a nation, of international relations.
Wonderful definition of solidarity. Solidarity is conversion of heart, probably of mind, of our will, of sight, of the way we are looking at one another. Paula, when I was talking with you just in the morning, I had that feeling that you know everybody in Poland, that you come here for many, many years. And I wanted to ask you, what is for you solidarity personally? Is it conversion, or is it just an abstract term?
Well, first, let me say thank you. I'm very honored to be here for this Congress. It comes, I think, at a very crucial time. You have had Congresses before, but especially because of what's transpiring in Ukraine is very, very crucial. And Ukraine is your neighbor, your very close neighbor and friend. And so what does Solidarność mean for me? First, I would say that when I think about the movement that took place here in Poland, well, it was unity. I think of that word, unity. As for conversion, no, I think it was a manifestation of the rights that every human being should, in fact, hold. There's no conversion, but what the workers did in Gdańsk under Lech Wałęsa, and then also the intellectuals, Adam Michnik, Jacek Kuron, among others that I'm not mentioning, but there were many, they came together because they wanted to fight against the stranglehold of communism and also the stranglehold of the quote-unquote Soviet Union over an independent Poland, and also it was for pro-democracy and pro-freedom. So every human being has those rights from within. It was a manifestation of what they were being deprived of. But what was remarkable was the unity that you did have those workers in the Gdańsk shipyard come forward and protest. And it was an interesting unity with intellectuals who didn't have a lot in common except for that basic human right and need. And they knew that Poland had every right to be independent, to determine its own course of action, and not be invaded or and different forms of invasion, but invaded from the east in a way that would undermine Poland's own religion, its sovereignty, its own culture, language, and course of action. So here, Solidarność, I think, was a very important movement, and a movement that also became very well supported by many. And if I may just add a few more points here, we are honoring Pope John Paul II, and he played an important role, as did the Catholic Church, during the time of Solidarność. He did because he was the inspiration, the very essence of values, the very essence of integrity and respect for human being and human life. But not only that, the Catholic Church here was crucial to the movement of Solidarność and those of workers. It was through the Catholic Church that important food supplies were disseminated. And not only that, but also it unified everyone. If I may say, two of the most cherished things that I have in my possession, one is I was given a printing press figure. It's flat, but on the front side of the printing press is the face of Father Popieluszko, who gave his life to this movement. As we know, he was brutally murdered by the Polish regime at the time. This figure his face also has a cross on it. And it is one of the things that I cherish. Here was the Catholic Church united in purpose with Solidarność. So as Oleg mentioned, very important, the importance of unity of purpose. All were united. And if I may also just mention, it wasn't at that time, but years later, because of my dear friend, I mentioned to Michał, that I knew he was known as Jan Nowak in the United States. He wrote the book, The Courier from Warsaw. But in Poland, he was Jan Jożerański. And he said, if you ever go to Rome, tell me. I will arrange a meeting with Pope John Paul II through Father Dziwisz. So I went to Rome, and I was given the choice, do you want a meeting or Mass? I chose Mass. I went to Mass, and I was lucky because I had witnessed a beautiful Mass, but afterwards, those of us from abroad were received by Pope John Paul II. He greeted me in Ukrainian, by the way. As many of you know, he spoke a number of languages. It was very beautiful. He said he knew of my father, but a cherished possession was my rosary. He gave me a rosary. So I wanted to share that because of the dedication here, and this Congress is in his honor. So last comment on your question. There was unity, not only the workers, the intellectuals, the church, but also I would be remiss if I did not mention the unity from abroad. I happened to work in the White House in the Reagan administration, and President Reagan felt very strongly about freedom in Poland and actually freedom in this part of the world. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and it was indeed an evil empire. And I remember at the time when martial law was imposed and solidarity was still rising up, he delivered a remarks which said and asserted, let Poland be Poland in this case. And he said, light a candle in every window so that we are united with the Polish people in their struggle and their fight against communism. So forgive me, it was a longer answer, but you gave me a chance to reminisce a bit here, being in this august castle and cathedral. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula, so much. You are the queen now, so you can do whatever you want here during that 40 minutes. And I'm really glad that you are taking your time. And of course, Oleg, feel free also to take your time. I want to combine those two realities. On the one hand, solidarity movement, unity. As Paula said, it's unity on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's individual human dignity. So it's kind of a polarity, really creative polarity between being human, being individual, and at the same time being united We either are united or are individualistic, but it's rare moments that we can combine those two realities, and probably solidarity was one of those moments. But you also mentioned simple things like food supply. On the other hand, very spiritual things like giving, like Father Popiełuszko giving his life to the cause. You cannot imagine more spiritual act than that. Just I show that my material life is not important. What is important is my eternal life in Christ. So there are those polarities. There are the life-giving polarities of solidarity movement. And let me move to Ukraine once again. Do you see any connection between solidarity movement and Maidans and now the struggle in Ukraine? Do you see any connection between the life of John Paul II and his acts here in Poland, on Polish soil, and his acts on your soil in Ukraine?
A lot of similarities and analogies. There are at least three that come into my mind. There are many more. One of them is a great celebration of the millennium of Christianity that took place in Poland. Right, this was 1966 that gave, this was the precursor of solidarity, kind of a recognition that even though we live in a country with socialism as our, in Polish context, ruling economic system and political system, but we have Christian roots. And so that celebration of the millennium gave, I think, the Polish people this realization that we are Christians, first of all, and then everything else, economy, politics, follows. As yesterday was said, that theology and politics are actually united. One cannot live without the other. And so in 1988, and this was also mentioned yesterday, John Paul II gave not a permission, he encouraged the celebration of the millennium of Christianity all over the world. In Soviet Union, main celebrations took place in Moscow, and they actually prohibited any special activities in Ukraine, even though Kievan Rus was baptized in Kyiv, and this would be the right place to celebrate the millennium, but all the great meetings and conferences and these triumphal things took place in Moscow. But in Ukraine, in this clandestine way, a lot of the parishes would install crosses in front of the churches, saying that this is 1,000 years. And I know that in Ukrainian diaspora, both Eastern Catholic, Greek Catholic, and also Orthodox, and many other communities would also gather together and create a lot of conferences and spoke about this heritage that we had. So this is one of the similarities. Another one is, of course, a visit of John Paul II in 1979 to Poland, which really was the start of the solidarity in that spiritual way, so to say. Of course, it needed time to grow and give the unity of the workers and intelligentsia and the church, but it took about 10 years. John Paul II came to Ukraine in 2001, and as I mentioned, this gave us Ukrainians an opportunity to gather together and to realize that we can't stand together. And if we are together in thousands, 200,000, 500,000, 800,000, almost 1 million in Lviv, for instance, that when we are together, praying together, that the government will be afraid of that, will feel accountable against that. I remember a funny thing was a Roman Catholic Mass in Lviv, and John Paul II was arriving to the Mass a bit late. It was about 40 minutes late, and the president of Ukraine was already on time. He was sitting and waiting with everybody else on that field, and there was a young Catholic priest, Eastern Catholic priest, by the name Boris Gudzak, whom you probably know, and he went up on the stage, and he realized that you need to fill in the void, so to say, and in front of the president of Ukraine, at that time, Kuchma, and there were some ministers and some officials, he would say that we are the Christian country and we believe in the commandments. We we have to live according to the law. We cannot tolerate things like corruption and things like that. Some of the things that were badly needed in the public square in Ukraine. So this was kind of a gathering, and then, of course, John Paul II came, and there was a moment of sacred time and experience. But this really was one of the most powerful moments when we spoke about freedom in concrete things, not in abstract things, because freedom, it's freedom of individual. Of course, freedom is ability to say what you want to say. Freedom is to be able to establish your own business, to have laws working to protect everyone, not just special groups, but actually we all have to be equal before the law, at least. So that's another similarity how John Paul II established a certain pattern in Poland and in the world, and also in Ukraine. And the third, well, his overall recognition, not just for Poland or Ukraine, but overall recognition of the culture and attentiveness to a human life, attentiveness to a personality, to a culture, to history, that really changed the whole narrative, I think, globally, and in Ukraine as well, that we, as a church, as a society, began to learn the lessons of the Catholic social teaching that was already available for almost 100 years, that we, when Maidan occurred in 2012, one of the main messages, and we call it a revolution of dignity. You have here a title, Revolution of Solidarity. I think that there is a certain parallel similarity there, that for Ukrainians, food, safety, all of those things are important, but the most important thing is the dignity, is the recognition that I'm a human being. I deserve to be treated in a dignified way. And for Ukrainians, it's a question of what we call a social contract. An old social contract is that a state takes care of the safety and gives you a piece of bread. But now we are in the middle of rethinking that social contract. Safety and food is important, but being entrepreneurial, it's expressing your ideas, having a democracy where different political parties have their voices and able to compete with each other. That creates this atmosphere of growth and embetterment, change. Well, I use the word conversion not in terms of that we don't have it, but we actually have it. I agree here with Paula, but sometimes we forget. It's bringing that light from within, being able to live a free way of life, free and responsible, of course.
So let me just summarize it. It seems that John Paul II needs around a decade to liberate a country. So he comes to Poland, 79, and then 89, we have semi-free elections. To Timor, 89, and then 99 elections. Yeah, that's to Ukraine, 2001, and 2012, Maidan. Am I right, or is just I just want to check out how do you see it?
Well, we would say 2004, 2005, the Orange Revolution was already a huge.
Like an equivalent of solidarity in Poland.
Something like that.
79, then 80 solidarity, right. 2001, right. 2003, 2004, right. Maidan, yeah?
Well, the Polish people, of course, had the advantage of being able to go and study abroad and have the experts. Ukraine did not have that opportunity. We were still the cold stuff. And that's why I think oligarchy was able to encroach into the country and freeze our development. But we live already in the 21st century. We have internet. We do have internet in Ukraine, right? We have phones. We know what's going on. We can read books. We translate them. We have universities. We have a public conversation that cannot be shut down. This is very important, which changes the way of what we expect from the government, what we expect from ourselves, of course. So yeah, it takes time. The circumstances change, but the pattern, I think, stays the same.
So yeah, then it explains why it's like 11 years rather than 10 years. So I want to check out that my hypothesis that just emerged. You met John Paul II personally. I was struck that that he knew about your father, that he approached you in the language of your fathers and ancestors. So he knew you somehow before you appeared. Yeah. So before you met him personally, he knew you already. So I was struck by that, and I would like to ask you, what is the key when you look also at the global impact of John Paul II? What is the key of his actions that are transforming for the world?
I think, plain and simple, what was key about Pope John Paul II was that he was never afraid to speak the truth. And seriously, that's important, because I will say that was not always the case of his predecessors or his successors. I'm going to say it diplomatically. I think that he was someone who was a man of faith, an individual who, though, did not see himself as isolated, but that the church had very much a responsibility in how life unfolds. And if there is an undercutting of human freedoms, in that case, I think he felt it was important to be speaking out about the truth and what is taking place, and not just only in this part of the world, but globally. And he did that. He did that in so many ways, and in so many countries, actually, where he did go and speak the truth, and in places where we know there was repression, Cuba being one, for example, in very different part of the world. But he was an inspiration, and very, very important, his leadership, because his leadership went beyond only, if you will, the religious freedom, if you will, and the whole values and principles associated with religion, but beyond that, of the practice of life. And if life is undercut and freedoms are undercut, he did not hesitate in speaking out. And in that case, I mean, he truly was and is a saint.
The same question to you, Oleh. You also was a young man, just like Martin Kalungu Banda I mentioned when he met John Paul II in 1989 in Zambia. You were also a young man at that time. So do you see any key for the transformative power, transformative role of John Paul II for that part of the world? What is the secret?
Right. We are in this historical place which is full of art. We say this all over again and again, that culture is a key to what's happening in the country. Yesterday somebody said that I think the gentleman from Hungary, that sometimes it's not how many politicians or what political party do you have, or you have political power. How many poets do you have in the country? I think this is a great strength, and we've talked about this so many times, that John Paul II was an artist. He was a philosopher. He was an actor. He was this a man that understood that if you want to survive Nazi regime or any other regimes, you have to cling to the roots of our country, of our nation, of our soul, and these are the religious roots, of course, and history, and also poetry, the literature. And I think that was the key to other nations. So when he came to Ukraine, he would cite Grigory Skovoroda, he would cite Taras Shevchenko, he would speak in Ukrainian to Ukrainians, which was almost a joke that a lot of the Ukrainian politicians were not able to speak Ukrainian, even though by law they would require, at least in the public square. But John Paul II, a man from a different country, was able to learn the language. When I had this short time of meeting him in one of the reunions in 2001, he came to Ukraine, but in 2000, a group of students and alumni of one of the programs came to Rome. We had this meeting. And when I approached John Paul II, we had, in 30 seconds, the most profound theological discussion. We talked about God, about Jesus, and about eternity. I told him, Slava Isusu Christu, and he said, Slava Naviki Bogovi, glory to Jesus Christ, glory be forever. And he did that in a very spontaneous way. He didn't have to think. He heard Ukrainian and he responded in Ukrainian, which was very endearing to me. I do also have his rosary as a family relic at home, and we pray with this rosary at home. But the key is, and this is what I agree with Paul, that sometimes is lacking from for instance, current Pope, that in difficult situations you don't try to simply diplomatically be neutral. That's sometimes damaging, but you have to understand what's really behind, what's really underneath, where there is real suffering, and who is a real victim and who is real aggressor, so to say. And sometimes inability to say this out loud, loses your authority in a certain sense, and moral authority. John Paul II was the one that would nail it right there, saying what is at stake, where is real human suffering, and who needs to be protected. So that is a really important key to have this diplomatic tradition, of being neutral, but at the same time, providing these symbols and these gestures that are very endearing, very sincere, very honest. Because honesty is something that you cannot buy. Honesty is in your eyes. It's in your trembling of the voice. It's not sometimes what you say, but how you say it, right? And that's what we are actually looking for today. And yeah.
So the question of authenticity, yeah.
May I add something further, because you asked me, and mentioned how he knew my name, my father's name and my name. Well, that was partly because Jan Dobriansky was the one who, through Father Jewish, made arrangements, but it raises an issue. And the issue is in something that you also said about culture. Let me take it a step further, and that is, it's about who we are, our respective nationalities. I am of Ukrainian descent, and I am appalled when I read that there are statements coming from Moscow saying that Ukraine is not a country, that there is no such thing as Ukrainian. I mean, you can't strip away my identity of who I am. So Pope John Paul, when he greeted me in Ukrainian, it's because he understood and knew the value of my identity, who I am, that yes, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language. And this is an important part of the whole essence of this discussion here, because of the movement, whether it's in solidarity, whether it's the vigorous and courageous fight in Ukraine today, and I'd also even pick out in the neighborhood, because it's in the neighborhood, the demonstrations and the movement that took place in Belarus, by the way, because of their not recognizing Tsikhanovskaya, her winning the election in Belarus. So here it's about identity, it's about who you are, sovereignty, your own culture, your own nationality. My father wrote the Captive Nations piece of legislation back in 1959. And every president since 1959 to the present has honored Captive Nations Week, which is the third week of July, and it recognized nationalities. You can't erase a country's identity or an individual's identity. And in Ukraine, what is happening is truly outrageous. And in this time, I will say, I personally see a fundamental difference from 2014, when there was the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then the invasion of Donbass and the displacement of some 1.4 million people lost their homes in the Donbass. And by the way, whether they were Russian speakers or not Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers, it didn't matter. They lost their homes. And in this case, now we're in this period, and I detect, in having visited Ukraine, a real fierceness and a determination to win and to really ensure that this doesn't happen again, that this kind of encroachment on Ukraine's own sovereignty, on its own integrity, and the integrity of the people cannot happen. And I'll end on this one note. In the United States, we watched a number of times the mayor of Kharkiv. I pick Kharkiv because it's in the east of Ukraine. He appeared a lot on CNN. And you know what his message was, relevant to what I just said? It was an important message. He said, I happen to be ethnically Russian. I'm a Russian speaker, but I'm Ukrainian, first and foremost. And he said, I've been told that this operation is to save us. He said, save us? He's murdering the people in my city. Russians are murdering people in my city. And so basically, you may know, there was success. They pushed the Russian soldiers back. They came in again, and they pushed them again. But I have to say more than anyone else speaking. I mean, Zelensky speaks very directly about these issues, but the appearance of the mayor of Kharkiv actually had quite a bit of traction because he was ethnically Russian and saying, this is outrageous, and we will fight to the death to ensure our territorial integrity and sovereignty of all of our people, no matter who they are and ethnically are.
You want to add?
There is a very interesting example in 2014, which is kind of a symbolic when Crimean Peninsula was annexed. And as you know, in Ukraine there are different religious groups. There used to be a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, and Kyiv, and all kinds of things. And so when Peninsula was taken over, the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, took a lot of the Ukrainian Orthodox churches. And this was an amazing gesture of the Crimean Tatars, who invited Ukrainian Orthodox to pray in their mosques, because their churches were taking away. So this is something unprecedented, that these religious differences even were put aside. What was the most important thing? It was the real human solidarity, to come together, to be able to pray, because there was invasion and taking the property and persecution and of course arrests and so on and so forth. But Ukraine is witnessing something for Ukrainian history unprecedented, the solidarity at its best, where when it goes about not just national identity, but about recognition of your freedom. Very often what we say, it's, they say that, well, maybe in these negotiations, let the Russians keep some territories and then we can have a peace. But we do know that this will not solve the problem. This will only postpone the problem, or it will freeze for a certain period of time, and then the Russians will keep going. So when you do not resist evil, you only encourage it. So it has to be stopped. It has to be stopped. And here, as a priest, as a Christian, or as a Ukrainian, I might say that this has to be taken place, or enforced, not through hatred, not through a feeling of wpłata,
revenge.
Revenge, right? That's what I'm looking for. This is not about revenge. It's not about only fighting for the soil. It's about values. It's about true values. If you recognize a state in its sovereignty and you've signed agreements, you have to really keep it. And here goes big thanks to the international community. It was recognized from 2014 that these are illegally or temporarily occupied territories, at least on the legal level. It was, stopped at that time, at that position, and we will be fighting for our independence, just like the Jewish state has the right to fight for its own sovereignty and integrity, and every other nation has the right to do so, because it comes from the concept of your dignity that is not only spiritual but also physical. So the territory is as if a body of your soul, right? If you cut off your hand, you will not be, you will be handicapped. We have to keep that in mind.
I was taking notes because I asked you about the key in the life of John Paul II for his transformative power, and you said that this is the truth, that he speaks the truth, and I'm glad that as a diplomat you said that sometimes you don't have to be diplomatic, so that's also a paradox, to be a diplomat, but also sometimes not to be very diplomatic. Authenticity, as you said, trembling in your heart, trembling in your voice, but also appreciation of whom we talk to, whom we approach. So and I think that those three things are transformed into trust, into relation. We don't trust people who just affirm us without being authentic or without speaking the truth. So we need those three things. And we can build trust, we can build relations. At the end of the day, I would say we can build friendships and love on those three values. And I think this is what John Paul II did. And my question is now to Paula. The role of friendship, and can we speak about friendship between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan in the fight against communism that was brought up yesterday by Mark Gopin? So I would like to ask you as a first-hand witness of that relation. Did you see the role of friendship? Did you see the role of personal relations on the world politics?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm singling out Monica here, who delivered, I know, in Washington, and was the inspiration of conference at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, one of the sponsors here, that actually focused on this very issue about the life of Pope John Paul II and his friendship, his deep friendship with Ronald Reagan. And why did they bond so closely? Well, Ronald Reagan believed in speaking the truth, and so did the Pope. I remember when Ronald Reagan delivered his speech early on in his administration and called then the Soviet Union an evil empire. And I remember some people gasped. But that kind of truth made them bond. And not only that truth, but because both of them understood the importance of human freedom. Pope John Paul II was all about it. That here, in terms of the importance of religion and of faith, that also part of that is who you are, your values, your very essence. And in that sense, so he definitely was one who was anti-communist. And why, if I can use that word? Because communism would undermine the practice of religion. I think of Catholicism. I mean, during that time, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, as we know, the period of history when it was eliminated. And those Catholics in Ukraine, for example, could not practice their religion truthfully and faithfully. And as Oleh had mentioned, the very property of the church was confiscated. So here, Ronald Reagan believed strongly in freedom of religion. He believed strongly in democratic values. He believed strongly in identity and also truth. And in that sense, that's where the two of them really bonded very well together. As I said, Reagan delivered that speech, I'll never forget it, "Let Poland be Poland." And, his involvement in what happened here in Poland during that period, that too was a way and means by which they bridged together. It was interesting about Reagan, this is a little bit different, but I take away your words about also not always looking at revenge, but looking at ways forward. And in that sense, I think you all know how Reagan looked to pave a way forward with Gorbachev. And one of their first meetings was very negative and did not end in the expectation that either side had wanted. But there, Reagan was determined to try to find a way forward, to forge some kind of path and some kind of relationship, even though, despite the fact that By the way, Gorbachev was not only a Communist Party member, at the outset, but a leader. He was the leader of the Communist Party in terms of his responsibility. So, I think it's that good and that goodness, and certainly what defined Pope John Paul II of the goodness, but also finding ways with those that you differ, finding ways of overcoming it and bridging. And with Reagan, he found a very, very strong partner indeed. Two leaders who are willing to speak out and to speak the truth and to lead people, but not inhibit the way people wanted to live their own lives.
Thanks, Paula. Within those several minutes we have to conclude our session, I want to, as you say, pave the way forward, pave the way to the future. So I want to ask you, both of you, what should we do, being inspired by John Paul II, but what kind of steps in that dire reality we are facing now, not only in Ukraine, but specifically in Ukraine, but also elsewhere in the world, in our nations as well. What kind of steps do you envision we should take to continue that revolution of solidarity, revolution of dignity, revolution of friendship, revolution of love? What steps, Oleh?
We have to conclude, so I have to be brief, right? So I could go on.
We have still 10 minutes, so...
Well, let me start, and then maybe we can come back. I'm thinking about two things. You mentioned this concept of friendship, right? And John Paul II, I remember somebody said, this is in his biography, that when he was elected to be a bishop of Krakow, so he was actually with his friends in the mountains. And so he had to travel from the mountains to Krakow, receive his honors and everything. He had his beautiful speech at the Mass, and somebody approached him and so, what will you do next? And he said, I will go back to the mountains because there are friends waiting for me. So, and he really cherished this very dearly throughout his life. The friends, both from his childhood and over the years that he met, and this is very important. So what is it important for the friendship? Two things. First is when we love each other, when we need each other, when we recognize that we cannot live without each other. The advantage of friendship over the family is that with family you have to do this on the daily basis. With friends it's a bit rarely, but for friendship it is important to have these meetings on a regular basis. We have to meet together because it's not enough to just have this one moment of inspiration and enthusiasm, because it fades away. But when and that's where institutions come in, and good practices come in, where we continue meeting together and eating together, hiking together. These things are important. So at first, a common value system, right? Love, I would call, and building it constantly. And this goes for international relations. This is what happened. This what worked with each other, right? With you and I, that we've been meeting over the years, and that's how friendship grows stronger. Ukraine has suffered during the Soviet period this isolation, and thank God we are able to come back to the world. We are able to return to Europe, so to say. We are in Europe, but we need these interhuman relationships. That's what happened during the refugees, these wonderful projects that Poland and other countries have been able to provide to Ukrainians. And the most important thing is that Ukrainians were able to see the world, and the world was able to see Ukrainians, and that relationship has to be sustained, in a different form, in the form of self-respect, cooperation, of course, all these things. So two things, yeah.
Paula, your solution. Friendship?
I'm going to give an answer. My life has been in diplomacy for over 30 years, and so I'm going to give a more not diplomatic, but to use your term, international relations, vested in international relations. First, I think that now it is imperative for the global community to be supporting Ukraine in its fight. I'm starting with Ukraine, but I'll broaden it. Why? Because I don't see that when President Zelensky speaks actually and gives his speeches, it's amazing. He gives his speeches everywhere, and he meets with everyone. He met with the president of Brazil at the United Nations. I happen to be in the Middle East, and there he's giving a talk on screen, and that's good. Why? Because he is making the case of Ukraine directly to people in whatever community. And it does relate to friendship, but it also relates to connecting. There are countries in and throughout the Middle East that actually their fate does depend on what happens in Ukraine. Right now, the grain embargo and the blockage, the grain blockage. By the way, Egypt depends 75% on its grain from Ukraine. And so when Moscow is blocking, in this case, and this kind of agitation is going on, it's not just about Ukraine, but it affects more countries. So first, I would say that I think when Zelensky makes the comments that this is not just a fight about Ukraine, it affects the global community, there is absolute truth in that. It's not only about what happens here, the sovereignty of one country. In the Far East, as you may know, Taiwan, they're also looking. The Prime Minister of Japan delivered a speech, Kishida, in Washington, and he said, we're very tied to what happens. Poland has been very generous not only in helping refugees, but in terms of the kind of military support, the kind of also moral support. So with this backdrop, let me say first, I think one of the most important steps to take is what I would call in diplomacy what the narrative is. I think far too often we worry about the moment, the particular, an issue here, an issue there, but we don't step back and think about what we're about. Reagan bonded with Pope John Paul II because he knew the importance of speeches and his remarks. Zelensky certainly knows the importance of speeches and communication. We in the West at large have not talked about what we are about, the values that we hold very dearly. We've been a bit remiss, a bit complacent. And because of Ukraine, I think there has been a kind of regeneration or rejuvenation. So the first is, I think we need to talk about what we are, who we are, the moral narrative, and that means in all walks of life, whether it's through religion and the church, whether it's through the diaspora, whether through it's our respective governments. I think it's absolutely essential because one of the biggest battles that we are facing at this time is disinformation. As I say this, 100% disinformation and distortion of what's taking place. So that would be my first answer to you. And my second answer is also one of a humanitarian one, and that is in terms of the numbers of individuals who have been displaced from Ukraine. Poland is very generous, not just only Poland, other countries throughout Europe, also United States, other countries, Australia also has taken in a number of Ukrainians. I think we have to also emphasize the humanitarian consequences here, and this brings me to my third and last. Because you mentioned the global community, and what about others? Others are very much affected by what's happening here, because if this is not only, should I say, cut back and curtailed, I wouldn't even use the word contained, but cut back where Ukraine gets its integrity and territorial integrity and sovereignty once and for all, that will have consequences for every part of the world. And one has to expose that, and that this is not just one simple example. There are other authoritarians in other parts of the world that will point to that case. Well, see, we told you, we prevailed. And that cannot happen. There has to be success here in Ukraine based on morals, based on values, based on its independence. Otherwise, this will affect the independence of others. And that would be the most concerning message. And if that is not conveyed, then what are we about?
Oleh, do you want to add anything? So, by way of conclusion, I will just quickly ask you, what is your next step on that path? What is your, Oleh, step on the path of friendship? What is your step on the path of diplomacy, of speaking the truth?
Well, I'm not just a priest at the parish, which has an important mission of giving hope and uniting people back at home, but I'm also a university professor, and this is part of my mission to go to conferences and speak not only about Ukraine, but also about, you know, I'm a specialist in early church and some other dimensions. I think my mission is, and this is what I've been doing and I will continue doing, is traveling, meeting with people, establishing new friendships and developing them. So this is, I think, what is important, and that's what my colleagues in Ukraine, my Ukraine Catholic University has been very successful at, you know, creating a whole network of universities, projects, summer schools, you know, all those things that some say that, you know, the future is about networks. So creating strong, sustainable networks of people, of friends that will, you know, establish a certain level of respect and the values that you're talking about.
You spoke about being a teacher. You are also a fellow of Harvard Kennedy School, so you can refer to also being a teacher as well.
Yes, but I'm going to take it broader, still with my former governmental hat, because I do care about foreign policy, I do care about national security. And right now, if Ronald Reagan was alive today, and if Pope John Paul II, he's here with us in spirit, but if both were here, right here, in being, I would say they would be horrified at what's taking place and the need to speak out. What do I plan to do? I plan to continue what I'm doing now, which is I'm part of a number of groups in the United States. The Atlantic Council is a think tank, in which we consult quite a bit with Poland. I was here in May and had the privilege of not only celebrating what we called Poland Week, by the way, to honor and to respect what Poland is doing in this fight, militarily, economically, and politically. But also, secondly, we had the privilege of meeting then with President Duda. Our work with and solidarity with Poland in this fight matters. So to me, I will continue to ensure that we do fight together, that we are supportive, that we do confer. Secondly, I think right now it's very crucial to be blunt about it. Ukraine has been stated very clearly it's in need of military assistance. I have marveled what Ukraine has been able to do in these circumstances on very little, but we must continue that. Sanctions must remain in place. And let me add, because I notice it's at the end of our time, I will also say, I think we also need to be guided a bit by Ukraine in their fight. There's some pushes in the United States for dialogue. My answer is Ukraine has put forward a 10-point plan, and Ukraine should be in the lead on when is the right moment for dialogue. It shouldn't be pushed into dialogue. I think that's very, very crucial here. So I plan to continue these activities which support the fight and also join with Poland and with NATO and with other like-minded countries in that fight.
So I want to thank you for that wonderful panel. What I'm taking from that panel is that importance that we see one another. I see you, you see me. I hear you, I understand you, and I appreciate you. So by way of conclusion, let us appreciate our wonderful panelists. Thanks so much.
Dziękujemy panelistom, dziękujemy moderatorowi. Tak myślę, może zabrakło troszeczkę o tym, czym i była, może czy jest to dziedzictwo Solidarności.
We spoke enough about solidarity heritage in the West. You may remember that in 1980s we were still watching the heritage of solidarity. Maybe we can discuss that next year for another panel. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will now break for coffee. We have 15 minutes for coffee, so I will see you in 15 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. And please remember to bring back your headsets. Don't forget to bring back the interpretation headsets. You will still use them today and need them today. So see you in 15. ladies and gentlemen. You're not exactly listening into what I'm saying, but without much ado, let me remind you of our partners, PKOBP, Totalizator Sportowy, Polish Gambling Association, Tauron, Industrial Development Agency, PGE Foundation, and Oleh Foundation. Our media patrons are the Polish TV, Radio Krakow, IPL, Polityce.pl, Gość Niedzielny, Wszystko co najważniejsze, magazine, and Deliberatio.eu. The organizers are Poland, the Grand Projekt Foundation, and Foundation for the Remembrance of the Victims of Communism. We are watched and heard all across the world thanks to the media coverage, for which I'm very grateful. Please remember to return your headsets. And as you leave for lunch, please take all your belongings, because we're not going back to this room. So please take all your belongings with you, because when you leave here for lunch, we will not be coming back to this room. So please take your belongings, your luggage. So this is it for the housekeeping comments. Now, we've done coffee break, so we are in for another panel. And this panel is entitled John Paul II and Leadership for the Future. This will be Moderator by Grzegorz Górny. Over to you, Grzegorz. Grzegorz will introduce his panelists, or his guests rather. Hello, everybody. This panel will be a little bit different than the previous one, because basically we will have a keynote lecture by Mr. Carl Anderson. For the last 21 years, he headed one of the most important and influential Catholic organizations in the world, namely the Supreme Knights of Columbus. He was the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus. He also has ample experience in working in the state administration. He worked for Ronald Reagan in 1980s. He also has an experience of participating in the life of the hierarchy church, because he was a member or a consultant of 4 papal councils. He is also an author of books. One of them was translated into Polish, Civilization of Love, that's the title. But for many years, Carl Anderson was also a direct witness to John Paul II's mission and activity. He was watching John Paul II's closely. So, we will now hear from Carl Anderson. He will talk about the vision of John Paul II for the future, or for our future. And after this lecture, we will have a brief discussion. So over to you, sir, Carl Anderson.
Well, thank you very much. Dziękuję. Last trip to Poland in 2002, Pope John Paul II said, "I am grateful for this invitation to visit my Krakow and for the hospitality you have given me." Then in 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI visited Krakow, he made these words of his predecessor his own, and then he added this: "Krakow has a special place in the hearts of countless Christians throughout the world who know that John Paul II came to the Vatican Hill from this city on the Wawel Hill, from a far country, which thus became a country dear to all of us." So with these words of Pope Benedict, they are especially meaningful to me today, and I am so honored to participate in this historic conference, in this historic venue. This month marks the 45th anniversary of the election of Karol Wojtyła as a successor of St. Peter, and the beginning of what is perhaps the most remarkable pontificate in the history of the Catholic Church since St. Peter's pontificate. So where to begin in assessing the vision of this great Pope, his legacy and his leadership? At the conclusion of the four quartets, T.S. Eliot wrote this: "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So let us take up T.S. Eliot's method and consider this great exploring Pope by returning to the beginning of his pontificate. After all these years, let us return to where he started in order to know him, well, if not for the first time, at least to know him better. On the day of John Paul II's inaugural Mass, the scripture reading included the words of St. Peter, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Nothing very surprising that the successor of St. Peter would begin his ministry repeating St. Peter's proclamation of Christ as the Messiah. But he proclaims them with the angelic salutation addressed to the Blessed Virgin Mary and then later to St. Joseph: "Do not be afraid." So nearly 2,000 years after Christianity, the Pope warns us not to be afraid. But not to be afraid of what? Those words of St. Peter, which virtually every Catholic knows and has heard so often, have become in a way routine and commonplace. And after 2,000 years of Christianity, what reason could there be to be afraid of hearing again St. Peter's declaration? St. John Paul II will explain the radical meaning he gives to this proclamation and its consequence for the entirety of his pontificate. John Paul II begins, "These words first of all." Now, 45 years later, we would say about him, "These words first, last, always, and everywhere, to the ends of the earth and to the ends of his earthly ministry." St. John Paul II begins his pontificate with the proclamation that Jesus is truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, and then the consequence of this proclamation: open wide the doors for Christ to his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. Certainly, John Paul II was thinking about Poland. That would soon be made very clear. During the next 27 years, it would be clear that he was also thinking about each of the 129 countries he would personally visit. He would exclude no one from this mission to let Christ speak to man, for Christ alone has the words of life. And it was the Pope's mission that Christ's words of life may reach all people. In the West, it was easy to see John Paul II's statement to open wide the doors for Christ as a call for religious freedom in countries where communist regimes had slammed shut the doors of society to Christianity. But he was not only thinking of liberty and religious liberty. He was thinking about liberty and its relation to the truth. Christ alone knows what is true about man. With the angelic salutation, "Do not be afraid," he announced a new evangelical engagement with societies around the world based on a Christian anthropology in which anthropology and Christology are inseparably connected. This Christological anthropology provides the coherent frame of reference for the Pope's mission, and his inaugural homily is the foretaste of what would come throughout his pontificate. 2 months after telling the world not to be afraid of Christ, John Paul II announced he would travel to Mexico. And 1 month later, he was in Mexico, praying before the miraculous image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. As a starting point for a new global evangelization, Mexico was an inspired choice. A devoutly Catholic country, Mexico had earlier in the century suffered a great persecution of the Catholic Church, which had resulted in thousands of refugees fleeing into the United States, the destruction of numerous churches and Catholic institutions, the killing of nearly 100 priests and countless laymen. In 1978, the Catholic Church continued to suffer dreadful, serious deprivations of civil liberties in Mexico. And the Pope's challenge to open wide the doors for Christ could not be missed by that country's political leaders of the Revolutionary Party that had governed the country for more than half a century. Now, many observers considered the Pope's visit to Our Lady of Guadalupe's shrine as routine because of his devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. But it was much more than that. It was a key to understanding his entire global ministry in two important ways. First, the mestiza face of Our Lady of Guadalupe was, as John Paul II would later write, an impressive example of a perfectly enculturated evangelization. John Paul II would not seek to evangelize from the outside, as if Christianity were some type of European export. His proposal for a new evangelization would be an enculturated evangelization. And second, for those who were paying attention, Our Lady of Guadalupe symbolized what John Paul II meant when he spoke of opening wide the doors for Christ. He was not seeking to impose something from the outside. Christianity had already been formative of Mexican culture for nearly 5 centuries. Christ was already within this culture, and it was the secularists in the Mexican government who were seeking to drive him out. It was a theme he would take up, of course, in Warsaw's Victory Square. The most dramatic demonstration of this theme came not in Mexico City on his visit to Mexico, but among the indigenous tribes from the poorest regions of Mexico, Oaxaca and Chiapas, at a village called Quilapan. John Paul II declared he would be the voice of those who cannot speak or who have been silenced. He insisted, the worker who with his sweat waters with his affliction cannot wait any longer for full and effective recognition of his dignity. He has a right to be respected. He has a right to have access to the development which his dignity as a man deserves. It is necessary to carry out bold changes. Opening wide the doors for Christ meant seeing Christ in the indigenous and building a society that respects the dignity of those on the margins. And 4 months to the day he left Mexico, John Paul II arrived in Warsaw to begin 9 days that would change the world. Now, much has been written about this pilgrimage, but I want to emphasize these words from his homily in Victory Square. To Poland, the church brought Christ, the key to understanding that great and fundamental reality that is man. For man cannot be fully understood without Christ. He cannot understand who he is, nor what his true dignity is, nor what his vocation is, nor what his final end is. He cannot understand any of this without Christ. Therefore, the Pope continued, Christ cannot be kept out of the history of man in any part of the globe, at any longitude or latitude or geography. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man, he concluded, is an act against man. Without Christ, it is impossible to understand the history of Poland. Now, for a Marxist regime and a Marxist ideology based on the exclusion of the false consciousness, according to them, of Christianity as the precondition of progress, it is difficult to imagine a greater challenge to that regime than what John Paul II said that day in Warsaw. The Pope had taken aim at the center of Marxist theory, but not in a theoretical or abstract way. It was a challenge arising from the actual historical experience of the people of Poland. Many in the West were astounded that the Pope had declared a new Ostpolitik, but the mistake was to think that what he said was limited to Poland and the nations behind the Iron Curtain. In other words, that the Pope was only talking about Ostpolitik. His words apply with equal force to the secularized liberal democracies of the West that have sought in one way or another to marginalize and privatize Christianity, and indeed all religion. Democracies in which it has become normative to disregard Christianity. 4 months after his triumphant pilgrimage to Poland, John Paul II would again cross the Atlantic for the first of his pastoral visits to the United States. And on the way, he would stop in Ireland for a message that would change the course of history in that country. Throughout 1979, Northern Ireland had witnessed horrific sectarian violence. Just weeks before the Pope's arrival, the Provisional IRA had killed 18 British soldiers in Northern Ireland. And on the same day, a bomb killed the 79-year-old Lord Mountbatten and his grandson. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had warned that Northern Ireland was in danger of becoming another Balkans. Distrust, mounting to hatred and revenge, is never far beneath the political surface, she said, and those who step onto this surface must do so gingerly. Pope John Paul II was about to do just that, but not so gingerly. The Pope had considered going to Northern Ireland. He had been invited there, but now with the violence, that had become impossible. So instead, the Pope chose the coastal town of Drogheda, close to Northern Ireland. Drogheda was the site seared into the memory of Irish Catholics. There in 1649, Oliver Cromwell's troops had committed the bloodiest massacre of Catholics in Irish history. Thousands had been killed. And there, in 1979, John Paul II came to preach reconciliation and forgiveness. If his impassioned address in Mexico and Quilipan and in Warsaw had been historic, his homily in Drogheda was equally so, and it was followed by 14 minutes of uninterrupted applause. Christianity does not commit us to close our eyes to difficult human problems, he declared. But what Christianity does forbid is to seek solutions to these situations by the ways of hatred, by the murdering of defenseless people, by the methods of terrorism. He continued, "The message I affirmed in Mexico and in Poland, I reaffirm today in Ireland. Every human being has inalienable rights that must be respected. The moral law, the guardian of human rights, protector of the dignity of man, cannot be set aside by any person or group or by the state itself for any cause, not even for the security or in the interests of law and order." Then he went on to talk about violence and he called the youth of Ireland to turn away from violence, to turn away from hatred, and instead to work for peace. And that's what resulted in the 14-minute applause. Now, it would still be years before the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement, but John Paul II had set a tipping point and altered the national Irish consciousness. Endless violence in Ireland was no longer an inevitable political reality. Protestants in Northern Ireland, hearing the Pope's passionate condemnation of violence, now knew that their suspicions that the Catholic Church was somehow secretly supporting terrorism were unfounded. And the dramatic response of Catholics also sent a message. Decades earlier, Mao Zedong had said the guerrilla fighter moves through the civilian population like a fish swims in the ocean. By their applause, Catholics in Ireland had announced that the ocean was drying up for terrorism. In Poland, John Paul II had promoted a new solidarity, what Joseph Tischner described as a solidarity of awakened consciences. He had now done something very similar in Ireland. And having made that homily, he boarded a plane for the United States and arrived later that day in Boston, where he celebrated a mass for more than 2 million Catholics, the largest religious gathering in the history of the United States. What awaited him in the United States was in some ways even more unexpected than what had happened in Mexico, Poland, and Ireland. For generations, Catholics in the U.S. had been an unpopular minority, caught between the cultural millstones of Protestantism and secularism. And like many Catholics in Western Europe, Catholics in the United States had been shocked by the reaction to Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. But in the United States, Protestants and secularists came together in their denunciation of the Pope. Even today, it is difficult to imagine the tsunami of protest that greeted the Pope's encyclical. In the decade that followed, Pope Paul VI was seen increasingly as frail, isolated, and elderly, a shepherd out of touch with his flock and leading an institution in disarray. The primary reason for John Paul II's trip to the United States was to address the United Nations. And on October 2nd, he flew from Boston to New York to address the UN for approximately an hour. He talked about human rights, but he also talked about safeguarding the objective rights of the spirit, of human conscience, and of human creativity, including protecting man's relationship with God. But the Pope's last stop in the United States was Washington, D.C., where he met privately at the White House with President Jimmy Carter. And Carter had been very gracious, saying, "You have moved among us as a champion of dignity and decency for every human being, and as a pilgrim for peace among nations, you have offered us your love, and we as individuals are heartened by it. You can be sure, Pope John Paul, that the people of America return your love." Then from the White House, the Pope went to the Washington Mall to celebrate Mass. Now, since the 17th century, Catholics in the United States had coexisted with a persistent form of anti-Catholicism, which historian Philip Jenkins has described as the last acceptable prejudice in America. And what fueled that prejudice was a firm conviction held by both Protestants and secularists that Catholics, and especially the Pope, should be denied political influence or power. And John Paul II had just addressed the world's governments, at the United Nations, and now on the Mall in Washington, he would change how Catholics in America viewed their Pope and how Catholics viewed their responsibilities as citizens. He did so by entering the public debate on one of the nation's most divisive issues, the issue of abortion. He said, "I do not hesitate to proclaim before you and the world that all human life, from the moment of conception and through all subsequent stages, is sacred because human life is created in the image and likeness of God. Nothing surpasses the greatness or dignity of a human being." And so he continued, "We will stand up every time that human life is threatened. When the sacredness of life before birth is attacked, we will stand up and proclaim that no one ever has the authority to destroy unborn life." Americans have been challenged to build what he would later describe as a culture of life and a civilization of love. And if before John Paul II came to the United States, the papacy appeared in disarray, after his visit, that was no longer the case. Time magazine placed the photograph of the Pope on its cover with the headline, "John Paul Superstar." In less than a week, John Paul II had not only restored the image of the Pope, he had brought a new unity among millions of Catholics with their Pope, and he had energized Catholics in the pro-life movement in America. Within a year of his election, John Paul II had shown the world what he meant when he said, "Open wide the doors for Christ," in the fields of economics, politics, and culture. He had championed social justice for the marginalized in the third world. He had advocated religious liberty and human rights for those suffering totalitarian oppression. He had promoted a new reconciliation to overcome the centuries-old divisions within Christianity. He had sought nonviolence and condemned terrorism. He had outlined a global human rights agenda among the world's diplomats. He had energized the pro-life movement, and he had found a new voice for Catholicism within the public debate of secular, liberal democracies. All of this deriving from that first homily, repeating St. Peter's proclamation that you are the Christ. In promulgating the Catechism of the Catholic Church, John Paul II wrote, "Vatican II has always been, and especially during these years of my pontificate, the constant reference point of my every pastoral action." The most important reference point of the Council for Pastoral Action was the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, and especially for John Paul II, number 22. The truth is that only the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. Christ fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. This Christocentric anthropology is foundational to both the pastoral approach of the Second Vatican Council and also the pontifical approach of John Paul II. This Christocentric anthropology was highlighted during his first pilgrimage to Poland, during a visit that is not so often discussed today, his visit to Auschwitz. And what he said on that occasion offers, I think, a most important way of understanding his pontificate and his leadership, his legacy, and his vision for the future. There, John Paul II said, "Can anyone on this earth be surprised that a pope who came from the archdiocese that contains this camp started his first encyclical with the words Redemptor Hominis, Redemptor hominis. And that he devoted, the Pope continued, it in full. It devoted his encyclical in full to the cause of man, the dignity of man, the threats facing man, the rights of man. The Pope's address at Auschwitz is exceptional, even among the many exceptional speeches he gave on that 1979 pilgrimage to Poland. The homily, obviously, is filled with personal emotion. In reading those words at the place which has come to symbolize the crucifixion of man, we can see that this man, Karol Wojtyła, was a man of this crucifixion, right? Not in an abstract way, not in an abstract way, but in a personal way. Day after day, he lived in this crucible of suffering, right? And then, year after year, he lived in the nightmare of communist totalitarianism. Right? So looking at his visit to Auschwitz, we can see his words are more than a dramatic moment in a dramatic pilgrimage and in a dramatic papacy. They reveal Karol Wojtyła, the man, the philosopher, the priest, the Pope. I have come, he said, to this Golgotha of the modern world. And he continued, 6 million Poles lost their lives here during this war. A fifth of the nation, yet another stage in the centuries-old fight of this nation, my nation, for its fundamental rights among the peoples of Europe, yet another painful reckoning with the conscience of mankind. Now, the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine recalls more than any other event in Europe since the Second World War, the suffering that occurred in this region of the world during the tyrannies of Hitler and Stalin. Between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, the world experienced global warfare in which more than 70 million persons died. And when we include those who died in Ukraine during the great Stalinist terror famine of the Holodomor, there were more people killed in Poland and Ukraine than anywhere else in Europe during the Second World War, or for that matter, more than any other place in the world at any other time in history. Historian Timothy Snyder has recounted this history of the deliberate and appalling genocidal killing of people between Berlin and Moscow under the title Bloodlands. The details of this appalling mass murder of more than 14 million people is so wrenching that one keeps telling oneself that it could not possibly happen again. And yet the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with its systematic targeting of civilians, the destruction of non-military infrastructures, demonstrates that the Bloodlands are not only a memory, they again can be a terrible reality. The war, I think, brings a new urgency to the message of John Paul II at Auschwitz. Facing the reality of Auschwitz, John Paul II goes to the root cause of the crisis, beyond nationalism, beyond racism, beyond ideology. In his address, the Pope references his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, and the anthropology of love that radiates through that document. Man cannot live without love, he writes. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it. Later, in his second encyclical, Divas in Misericordia, he develops this Christian anthropology. He writes, "It is God who is rich in mercy, whom Jesus Christ reveals. Then John Paul II outlines how mercy becomes the foundation of the civilization of love. And if there is to be a culture war between this civilization and others, how Christians ought to engage in it. He writes, this authentically evangelical process is not just a spiritual transformation realized once and for all. It is a whole lifestyle, an essential and continuous characteristic of the Christian vocation. It consists in the constant discovery and persevering practice of love as a unifying and elevating power. For John Paul II, this Christocentric anthropology is not proposed as an inspirational theological ideal to promote some greater public service, and nor is it a way of instrumentalizing Christianity to support public policies to bring about a change in society. It is proposed, especially when you hear him talk in Auschwitz, it is proposed as a Christian form of realpolitik, necessary to avoid a repeat of modernity's great tragedy. John Paul II proposed a culture of life and a civilization of love, and the Christological anthropology foundational to it as a unifying and elevating power for the rebuilding of society. In the American context, one thinks of the extent to which secularism has displaced the role of Christianity in just this dimension, that is, the ability to influence public life. The militantly atheist American philosopher Richard Rorty articulates this trend when he writes of Americans who hope, quote, to separate the fraternity and loving kindness urged by the Christian scriptures from the idea of its supernatural parentage. And especially of those Americans who, he observes, take pride in what America might, all by itself and by its own light, make of itself, rather than America's obedience to any authority, including the authority of God. And toward the end of his life, Rorty explained to Jürgen Habermas his hope that someday my remote descendants, he said, will live in a global civilization in which love is pretty much the only law. The problem here, seems to me, is what psychologists might describe as defensive hope. That is, an unrealistic defense mechanism to defend against having to face a disappointing reality about someone or something we love. There simply is very little evidence to suggest that Christian virtues and values such as brotherly love and loving kindness can be sustained in a society that has severed them from what Rorty calls their supernatural parentage. Nor can we find any evidence that the great atheist regimes of the 20th century came anywhere close to a civilization in which we could conclude that, quote, love is pretty much the only law. Psychologists recognize that it requires courage to move beyond the illusions and false sense of security that accompanies the psychological condition of defensive hope. In such a situation, a therapist might decide that the road to recovery begins with 4 simple words. Be not afraid. That's 3 words. Do not be afraid. That's 4. Leadership for the future not only should be understood within the context of a leader's vision for the future. I have suggested that John Paul II's vision for the future was clearly articulated during the first year of his pontificate, as was the anthropology underlying it. I would like to conclude with a quotation from Max Weber, not from his famous Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but from a 1919 lecture he gave on the subject of leadership. He said, "It is immensely moving when a mature man, no matter whether old or young in years, is aware of a responsibility for the consequences of his conduct and really feels such responsibility with heart and soul. He then acts by following an ethic of responsibility, and somewhere he reaches a point where he has to say, 'Here I stand, I can do no other.' And that is something genuinely human and moving, and every one of us who is not spiritually dead must realize the possibility of finding himself at some time in that position. Insofar as this is true, an ultimate ethic of ends and an ethic of responsibility can join in unison to constitute a genuine person. John Paul II is precisely this mature, genuine person, not on one or two occasions, but throughout his papacy and his life. And we are accustomed to describing John Paul II as one of the great leaders in the history of the Catholic Church. But instead, I think in this conference, we have considered the possibility that rather we should think of him as one of the great leaders in the history of the world, a world leader, but with a profound difference, a mature and genuine man who devoted his life to realizing the immense implications of Peter's proclamation that Jesus is the Christ. The historic opening words of his papal ministry, "Open wide the doors for Christ," was John Paul II's way of beginning a dialogue with the world about how that proclamation changes everything. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. These words were not written days earlier for a homily in St. Peter's Square. They had been written years earlier in the quietness of Carol Wojtyła's own heart, and the writing there had made all the difference. Every religious community encourages a distinctive spiritual character and moral way of life. During the last century, Poland experienced an extraordinary spiritual revival, reflected in the lives of saints such as Maximilian Kolbe, Faustina Kowalska, Albert Szymilowski, John Paul II, as well as the countless Polish martyrs and witnesses to the faith, such as the recently beatified Ulma family. But these saints did not live in isolation. They were part of a religious people. We may even say a Christian people with a distinctly Christian character, both moral and spiritual. A Christian people for whom self-sacrifice, mercy, and charity were formative and deeply rooted in their sense of community, a sense of community that made possible the spiritual and moral triumph over the evils which they endured during more than half of the 20th century. That distinctive character made possible the national response to John Paul II's 1979 pilgrimage to Poland, which gave life to the Solidarity movement and which laid an important foundation for what John Paul II would later call the civilization of love. This character is today reflected in the extraordinary response of the people of Poland to the refugee crisis resulting from the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine. And these people today, in so many ways distinctive within the Catholic tradition of Europe. Are these people capable of reintroducing into Europe a new discourse concerning Christianity? In Ecclesia in Europa, John Paul II spoke of the need for Christians in Europe to engage in a charity that evangelizes. So the question arises, are Slavic Christians who for centuries have found in Christianity a unifying and elevating principle for their culture and their nations, able to reintroduce Christianity in the postmodern, post-liberal society of Europe through a Christian experience of mercy and charity? I began these remarks with a reference to John Paul II's last visit to Poland, and I will conclude with a quote from his final address at the airport here in Krakow. I hope that Poland, which has belonged to Europe for centuries, will find its proper place in the structures of the European community. Not only will it not lose its own identity, but it will enrich the continent and the world with its tradition. Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy za ten wspaniały wykład.
Thank you for this fantastic lecture.
Te historie, o których Pan
Well, the
opowiadał,
histories you've
były też
described
związane z
were also
pontyfikatem
related
Jana Pawła II
to
i
the pontificate of John Paul
Ronalda Reagana.
II
I Pan miał
and the
takie
presidential term of
uprzywilejowane
Ronald
miejsce,
Reagan.
że mógł z bliska
You were privileged
obserwować
enough
te
to be
relacje.
able to
Pan
watch
pracował
these
wtedy
relations rather
w
closely.
administracji
You were
Ronalda
there part
Reagana.
of
O
Ronald
tym też
Reagan's
wspomniała
administration.
wcześniej pani Paula Dobriańska,
Paula
która
Dobriansky
mówiła o tych
mentioned that as
relacjach.
well. I
Ale
mean, the
jakby
relations
Pan
between
mógł się
President
podzielić takim
Reagan and John Paul
osobistym
II.
świadectwem
Would you be
z
able to
tamtych
share
czasów?
some personal
Jak wyglądały te
testimony
relacje,
from back
które
of these
zmieniły
times? What
oblicze
were
świata?
these relations like? And they changed the face of the world, didn't they?
Well, I didn't have as much experience as Paula did, Ambassador Dobriansky, with foreign policy, but I did, for several years, work with religious communities. And in fact, one of my first events was Nations Week, signing of the declaration, which President Reagan signed at the Ukrainian National Shrine in Washington, D.C., back in about 1985. So things are all sort of coming back together. I think one of the real important aspects of the friendship between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan had to do with the attempted assassination of both of them. And of course, St. John Paul II famously said, one finger pulled the trigger and another finger guided the bullet. And President Reagan had never expressed it quite in that fashion, but had the same sense that his life had been saved for a higher purpose, and he was devoting what remained of his life, not to his re-election several years later, but to this higher purpose. They were both strong believers, obviously, in God, and that motivated a very strong, I think, bond between the two of them. And, President Reagan, his father was Catholic, was a member of the Knights of Columbus. His mother was Protestant. He was raised as a very religious person. And that motivated. And I think that's what cemented the bond between the two of them. And I think that's a good part of the story, why they felt. Reagan also, as a young man, had been a lifeguard on a river in Illinois called the Rock River. And when he retired from the presidency, he had a picture of the Rock River in his office. And even when his Alzheimer's was rather advanced and people only, very good friends would come to see him in his office, and sometimes he would kind of slip away in the conversation. He would come back and point to the photograph, and he would say, I rescued 70 people from that river. So Reagan had a vision, an identity of caring for others, sacrifice, willing to be sacrificed, right? Because a lifeguard sometimes puts his life in danger to rescue somebody, the other person. And so I think Reagan had a inbuilt sense of solidarity, which then naturally kind of came to the fore with John Paul II in Poland. So I guess that would be my observation. I'm sorry, I'm beginning to get a little bit of a cold, and I think you can kind of hear that.
Okej. Pytałem o przeszłość, o
Right. So I was asking you about these historic times, about the time of Ronald Reagan, but let me now fast forward to the future. I just read recently this analysis by a theologian from the West who compared the history of the Catholic Church to a stream, to a river stream. And he says, if we fast forward to the future 100 years and then we look back at our present times, he says, we will view the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI as two Don Quixotes who were trying to stop the stream and reverse the river, which you can't do. Some changes cannot be reversed. Some changes are so deep and so profound that there is no way you can actually walk the walk of what John Paul II and Benedict XVI were proclaiming. They're saying it's inevitable, says the theologian, the analyst. And he says, well, both popes should be respected, but we must realize that the church will follow and flow in a different direction than they would want it to. So first of all, do you agree with this diagnosis, sir? And then second question, where would these opinions come from? I feel that more and more often these opinions are dominating, or such opinions tend to dominate Catholic debate as well, a Catholic discourse, not only in the secular world, but it seems that this is being a dominant narrative.
Well, where to begin? I think that, first of all, G.K. Chesterton once, about 100 years ago, said about St. Thomas More that Thomas More is more important today, in the 1920s, than he was at the time of his death, but he's not nearly as important as he will be 100 years from now, which is today. I think we'll find the same thing being said about St. John Paul II, that he is the Pope for the future. He is the Pope of the Second Vatican Council. I tried to show that with the whole question, and it's something theologians can discuss in more detail, but if you have the pastoral constitution, the pastoral mission of the Church in Gaudium et Spes, then you have a question of what is the anthropology. And if the question is what is the anthropology, it's number 22 and 24, which with number 24 reads into solidarity. You could do a theology of solidarity from Gaudium et Spes. So I think really, if the council is part of this process and not a looking backward, but is in fact the future for the church, I think John Paul II truly is the Pope of the Second Vatican Council. Now, I think the problem here, and it's been a problem that's been going on for, at least in the United States, 50, 60 years. You can take many examples, but one example would be Harvey Cox's book in 1965, The Secular City, in which he argues that secularism is inevitable It's a part of modernity and science, and therefore the church must accommodate itself to secular society, stop using sacred vocabulary, start using a sort of a more material vocabulary and ways of presenting itself that secularists can understand better. This notion of the inevitability of secularism, which is what I think is underlying the comment about the church as a stream that has to go forward, is really an assertion that the church must accommodate itself to modernity and the Enlightenment assumptions, which are basically not Christian assumptions. I think it's like Caesar Augustus telling the early church fathers they must accommodate themselves to the Pax Romana. And the early church was saying, no, because the Pax Romana is founded on a false understanding of man, a false understanding of his purpose and ultimate end, and therefore a false understanding of community, not to mention a false understanding of religion. So it would have been very easy in first century Rome to say, well, you know, this is a pretty successful operation here, and who are we to oppose it? Right? You can look around the modern world as a pretty successful operation, and who is the church to oppose it? I think the church opposes it in the way that I discussed, the way John Paul II presented it. It's a different understanding of man. And it's an understanding of, why do you seek justice? Why are you committed to equality? Why are you committed to liberty? It's because you love your neighbor, right? You love your neighbor. And I think the remarkable thing about John Paul II is just a little footnote, but it was referenced yesterday about his Jewish friend in the Catholic Church. You don't belong here. Well, doesn't she realize that we're all children of the same Father? We're all children of the same God. If you are proclaiming Christ as Messiah, you have to have a pretty good understanding and appreciation and respect for the Hebrew scriptures and tradition of which the Messiah is coming out of. So I think that it may at first blush seem as though a Christocentric anthropology is somewhat exclusionary. I think precisely the opposite is the case, and I think solidarity in Poland is a reflection of that in a very concrete, graspable.
Tu się chyba zgadzamy, że Jan Paweł II
I believe we agree that John Paul II has left a great intellectual and spiritual legacy. However, the question arises, who will now take up this work? Do you see communities, any communities nowadays which could take up and continue this legacy and heritage of John Paul II? So who in the church could now take up John Paul II's legacy?
You took a long time to say that. I think the people in this room. Part of the reason why I think I caught a cold, we spent some time in coal mines earlier this week, and we went to the museum at Wielki mine, right? Which is, if you haven't seen this, is absolutely fantastic. When you see that, you're not dealing with great intellectuals. You're not dealing with great educated people. You're not dealing with diplomats. bureaucrats and the elites of society. You're dealing with believers and men who are brothers. Because when you go down into that coal mine, you realize that there is an existential solidarity there, because you depend on the man next to you. And so I think John Paul II did what I think a true leader does. He inspires. He says, this is possible, and you have the ability to achieve it. And I think part of what we see in a democratic society is we have to remove notions that we have this hierarchical institution called the Catholic Church, which is going to solve our problems from a top-down methodology, when in fact, democracies are evangelized horizontally. We can't just baptize the prince and then everybody follows suit. And evangelizing horizontally means the common Catholic families. And if there's a doubt that that type of Catholicism exists in Poland today, in Polish culture, look at how you don't have any refugee camps in Poland for the Ukrainians. And in fact, if you go back and look at the 20th century history between Ukraine and Poland, it hasn't been that exactly easy, right? Galicia and some other places, it was not a good time. So this idea of Catholic family, the Ummah family, right? Those people, they sacrificed their children to try to save these Jews. And they were not the only family. There were over 3,000 have been declared righteous at Yad Vashem for trying to save, right? Don't tell me those families don't continue to exist in Poland. They need some empowerment, and I think that's what John Paul II did. He didn't come and say, pass this law, promulgate that regulation. He inspired people with certain principles and the idea that what you do can matter, can make a difference, can change. And then he sort of let the laity do what they could. And you saw the results in Gdansk. You saw it in the miners' strike and other places, the intellectuals, the youth. And I think going through that museum, one of the things that really was phenomenal was you can see a very centralized totalitarian government losing its grip, losing control, because of this spontaneous, sort of unorganized network of people just realizing they can be free. And if they have Christian values, they can move forward on it. And you know, the first several years after martial law, I mean, there was a certain amount of hopelessness in Poland, right? Is the situation as bad today as it was under martial law? So I think the other question, and then I'll stop, is, was this huge crucifixion in the 20th century for Slavic people and the great saints that are part of this period of history? Was all of that so that Poland could just meekly join the European Union and begin to slide towards secularization? I don't know. I think some people would like us to believe that secularism is inevitable. And I think secularism, a better understanding of secularism is that it's been foisted, at least in the United States, has been foisted by a revolutionary, loose-knit network of activists that have gone on for 100 years. in the United States, under the mythology that this is inevitable, so don't oppose it. And I don't think it's true. And I certainly don't think it's true in Poland.
Okej, thank you. Dziękujemy bardzo za
Thank you very much indeed
te odpowiedzi,
for
za ten
offering us all
wcześniejszy
these
wykład.
answers and
Wszystko
for
to
your
bardzo
keynote speech.
poruszające.
All of this is very
Myślę, że
moving.
Takie godne podsumowanie tych
So I guess the apt conclusion of the Congress
Podziękujmy panu
may
Karlowi
begin by
Andersonowi.
first of all thanking Carl Anderson with a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Tak, bardzo dziękujemy za te inspirujące słowo o tej wielkiej katolickiej rodzinie.
Thank you
i za
very
ten
much
też
for
te
these
słowo
most
duchy, że
inspiring words of
działanie
the
każdego
Grand
z
Catholic
nas
family,
może przyczynić
and
się do
also for
wielkiej
giving us
globalnej
hope that
zmiany
we
i
can
że
all
wszystko, co
contribute
wolno
to
nam
the large global
na świecie jest
change, and
tak
that not
do końca. Bardzo
everything
dziękuję
has
jeszcze raz,
already
brawa
been
dla naszego
decided. So
szanownego
once again, thank you to Mr. Carl
gościa
Anderson,
z daleka.
our fantastic
Thank you for your
guest
words,
from a
professor,
country
about
far
the
away.
Catholic family. Proszę Państwa, zbliża się koniec,
And
ale
so,
jeszcze nie
ladies
taki
and
finalny.
gentlemen,
Chciałbym
we are
zaprosić na
about to
scenę
conclude the
dwóch
Congress. So
dżentelmenów,
let
bez
me now
których nie byłoby
invite
nas
two
tutaj
gentlemen to the
wypowiedzi, którym
stage
ten
who made it all
kongres jest
possible.
Grzegorz Górny i
Grzegorz
Łuczewski.
Górny and Michał
Poproszę o
Łuczewski.
podsumowanie chyba tak
And
po
I guess
tych 2 dni.
we will be concluding on 2 days of the
Bo
Congress
jest dyskusja, kiedyś
in
trzeba
a
było
discussion.
sobie
It is always
Szanowni
most
Państwo,
interesting when we have a
proszę brawa.
discussion. So let's welcome them with a round of applause.
Może ja bym na początek
So maybe to
powiedział,
start
że,
with, allow me to
ten
say
kongres byłby
that this
niemożliwy
Congress
też
wouldn't be
bez wielu
possible
innych, osób,
if it
nie
was not for many
tylko
other
nas
people,
i
not just the two of
przede
us.
wszystkim w pierwszym rzędzie bez
First and foremost,
pani Anny Bieleckiej,
without Anna
prezes
Bielecka, the honorary
Fundacji Polska
president
Wielki Projekt,
of Poland, the Grand Project,
bez naszych
without
pracowników,
our
wolontariuszy,
employees, our
wszystkich
volunteers,
osób, które były w to
all the
zaangażowane,
people
nie
who took
mówiąc
part
już o,
in this endeavor,
członkach biura
not to
organizacyjnego,
mention the
także
organizational board
przyjechali do nas z daleka, jak na przykład pani Monika
and Monika
która,
Jabłońska,
z Waszyngtonu,
who flew all the way from
kierowała
Washington
też tą
and
częścią
who was
amerykańską
responsible for the American
naszych prac, bo
part
mieliśmy
of our
sporo
work,
gości także
because
z
we
Stanów
did have a number of
Zjednoczonych,
guests
także
coming from the
dziękujemy
US. So thank you
zaangażowanym w to
to
dzieło.
everybody.
Widzę, że Państwo coraz dłużej klaszczą.
I can see you applauding longer and longer, so I guess it will take us to these 14 minutes of non-stop applause that Karl Anders said. Now to conclude, we would like to share a number of reflections that came to our minds and hearts.
swoich refleksji Grzegorz się podzieli
I will share my own reflection, and I'm sure Grzegorz will share his. Well, it was a travel through time and continents for me. We are in a very specific place, very specific room, but still we managed to travel through time and space to understand who John Paul II was. I guess we made this kind of exercise in Poland. Maybe this was the first time we really engaged in that. You may find it controversial, but sometimes it is said that history is too important to leave it to the historians. I think John Paul II is too important to leave him to the Poles only. When we leave him to the Polish people, we start to quarrel, we start to pull and push. But when we look at John Paul II, at what he really was, or whom he really was, namely that he was able to change the face of the world across the continents he visited, then we can have a different perspective when looking at John Paul II. Maybe we can become a bit more objective. We can use other people and other nations' perspective. So we can view John Paul II as a historical person. This is what Mr. Anderson spoke about, and also Mr. Szczerski. He was the first, but maybe also the last global leader.
To jest moja pierwsza lekcja, którą ja biorę
So this is the first lesson learned that I draw from this meeting, which of course wouldn't be possible without our fantastic guests and visitors. Allow me to add a reflection that was born not just during this debate, but also in the lobbies. This is where we spoke about various things. There was small talk, but not only. We also spoke about John Paul II himself. We discussed the lectures, we discussed the panels, and we saw how it all resonates with human beings, with people. So the lobby discussions about John Paul II brought me some inspiration and had me reflected on John Paul II. That's why I feel it is very needed. I mean, there is a need to organize meetings like that, so that we can share the experience we had with John Paul II. And this experience is vivid, it's alive, and we need to translate it into our own language. I really enjoyed the keynote by Carl Anderson, where he spoke of Chesterton, about Thomas More, namely that his sacrifice and his deed was important when he was dying, but perhaps it is even more important now, and it may become even more important in the future. I remember when John Paul II died, then here at the Krakow Fields, I was talking to John Voigt, who was an author of John Paul II biography, and he told me that the Church would need some 500 years to understand, to reflect upon, and to implement this richness of John Paul II's intellectual and spiritual heritage. And then I thought, well, he's exaggerating, 500 years, come on. But now we're saying that there is de-Voitilization happening in the Church, namely the Church is moving away from Karol Wojtyla, from John Paul II. But maybe John Voigt was actually right. Maybe we never consider a long-term impact on the Catholic Church. Well, time passes a little bit differently in the Catholic Church. When St. Augustine was writing his books, apparently they had even bigger impact hundreds of years after his death than during his contemporary times. So John Paul II, as the first great thinker in the Catholic Church, was the first one to understand the topic of human sexuality, corporality. I mean, he was the first after St. Augustine. So maybe his impact will be rightly measured and rightly seen only from a long-term perspective. Again, this is a reflection that came to my mind. May I draw on it a little bit? I had a similar vision. We're speaking about thousands of years. Not often do we speak about the thousands of years perspective unless you're a historian. And here we have a leader who comes back, or who goes back rather, to the sources of culture. Oleh Kindiy spoke about the celebration of the millennium of Christianity. So here he comes 1,000 years or 2,000 years if you look at Hebrew script. So he goes back to the past just to be ahead 100 years in the future. Cardinal Wyszyński once said to Karol Wojtyla, "You will be one to introduce the Church into yet another millennium." So again, this was not 2 years, 5 years or 10 years perspective. In order for us to have this hundreds of years perspective, sometimes we need to go back to square one. We need to go back to where it all started. And that's what we did, for instance, yesterday when we went to the Babel Cathedral, where we were able to appreciate the floor paneling from St. Stanislav's canonization, which is the mid-13th century. So when you enter there, you can see the history, you can see the rock And you may imagine what it felt like back at that time. This is the rock you can lean upon, and you can use it as edifice that is there to support your faith over the centuries. So even if you're thorn in between two millenniums, this may also help you reflect on your own life.
Jeszcze taka jedna refleksja, która się
And
też
one more
pojawiała
reflection
bardzo często tutaj w rozmowach.
that happened quite often in the lobby talks.
Że jak to wszystko, o czym my mówimy,
So,
wytłumaczyć
how can
młodzieży.
we bring it all home to the young people? How can we all explain it to the young people? We are all John Paul II generation. No, not all of us. Look, there are guys who were born in 1990s. Piotr, for instance. Fine, but most of us would remember John Paul II from our own personal experience. And now, when we look at certain snapshots of John Paul II's image and his words, there is this memories and remembrance flashing in. We are getting emotional, we've got streams of association. But for those people who become adults after John Paul II's death, John Paul II seems to be an edifice, a monument of history. So question, quite often heard in the lobby, how can we translate all this experience and our memories? How can we translate it to the young people? How can we reach young people? And again, I had this reflection that maybe we should go back to John Paul II as a young man, so that young people can relate to him. And this formative experience for John Paul II that really influenced him was certainly the Second World War. Well, not that often is that mentioned, but during the Second World War, Germans eliminated and closed down all Polish universities and colleges. There were only primary schools which allowed 4 graders, 4 grades, and they were only teaching reading, writing, and some basic arithmetics. There was no geography, no biology, no history, so generally speaking, Poles were supposed to be a nation of slaves. Any attempt to get some education, you could be punished to death. And John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła back then, was taking part in these covered educational classes, so he was putting his life at threat for knowledge. He decided, well, I will take that risk because I really need to be educated. And then Polish theaters were banned, no Polish plays were performed. And again, there were underground theater, like the Rhapsody Theater, where Karol Wojtyła played as an actor. And again, this was threatened with the death punishment. And he decided to risk his life too in the name of the arts. So John Paul II was engaged in an underground conspiracy organization called the Union, which was founded by Jerzy Braun, the last delegate of the national government. And again, John Paul II was risking his life to demonstrate that there is something that you may want to sacrifice your life for, namely your homeland. And this takes me to point number 4, when John Paul II joins the underground covered seminary, which is again an illegal entity. Back then, in order to enter the seminary, he has to be released from the oath he took in the Union conspiracy. So there is an organizational meeting whereby he has to be released from his vows at the Union, and only then is he allowed to enter the seminary. So all that demonstrates that there is this reality for which John Paul II decided to sacrifice his life, to take a risk, and this is fate, this is God, for which John Paul II didn't hesitate to put his life at risk. So John Paul II is a little bit like a hero from the war series where you can see young people doing the right thing in extreme circumstances. So John Paul II was just one of these men of honor. Yes, indeed. And so, last reflection that I would like to share with you, John Paul II and his path. We can only see the end of it or the middle of it. And for me, when I think of John Paul II, he's always the most interesting figure for me at the beginning of his path. I think he did grand thing when he was younger than me, and also as a young man. When he was 14, and he asked Kluger, "Don't you know that we are children of one God?" So there were so many things that he did as a young man. We can't learn about it from history books, can we? So the way I view John Paul II's life is to look behind the words that he has proclaimed, but to look into the gestures he's made. I'm sure you know what he was doing on the 1st of September 1939 when the Second World War broke out. I'm sure the participants of our leadership seminar know that. This was the first Friday of the month, so he actually came here to the Wawel Hill, which is what you do on the first Friday of the month, and this is when bombing of Krakow commenced. If you took by train, well, the railway station was bombed. If you took a plane, this is where the airport was bombed. So people started to flee the Wawel Cathedral. But he and priest Figlewicz, Father Figlewicz from Badowice, remained here. So for me, this moment, the war breaks out, and here they are in the Wawel Cathedral, doing their thing, celebrating the Mass as you do, risking their own life. This is what I see very vividly in front of my eyes. Here they are, two people. And so the question, where did he have this power from? Where did he have this feeling of presence without being worried of the future? So when I talk to my students, I always say, well, you can reject John Paul II, but where do you take your power from? Where do you take your strengths? How are you able to build friendships, love? Where do you find this meaning of life? And in this respect, John Paul II was perhaps less needed for my generation because, well, we did quite fine. We were able to live our life, while the young generation, which is full of unease, full of questions, full of worries, and sometimes disintegration, well, this is the generation that needs John Paul II even more. Paradoxically speaking, well, the young generation rejects the remedy that it may help cure them. Apparently, they see the remedy as poison. And it is indeed a challenge for us. How do we demonstrate the truth about John Paul II, and how can we bring it home to the young people and help them do the right thing? It is also our personal vow, our personal duty to bring John Paul II closer to the young generation, so that for young people, John Paul II can become a source of inspiration, as he is a source of inspiration for so many visitors and people who have joined our Congress. We did mention Wujek coal mine. So just to conclude, may I read a quote from a person whom you don't know, Jerzy Wartak. He's already dead. I interviewed him a few years ago. He was interviewed for me for the benefit of a book about solidarity. It was translated by Oleh into Ukrainian just before the war. So just to demonstrate that there are some relations in between us that we fail to recognize and that are not that very obvious, but they create new reality. So I will leave you with a question asked by Jerzy Wartak. This is a question asked by a simple worker, a simple miner from wujek coal mine. He was actually wounded and he lost a number of his friends. He describes the death of John Paul II and the breakthrough that it is initiated in his life. And something broke in me back then. I cried like a little boy who had his father taken away from him and who doesn't know what to do. But then I thought, don't cry, stupid. Holy Father was not taken away by God. He was given to us. Those nice boys that were called by the militia last week were also given to God by us. And this was the first time that I thought of the militia members in different categories than the murderers, the killers. The TV read John Paul II Testament, and I was thinking, do I write my own will? When St. Peter asks me, what did you do, young boy? What will my answer be? That I worked for my wages, that I spent some time in prison for freedom. That is not enough. That's not good enough.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękujemy.
Thank you very much.
Grzegorz Górny i Michał Łuczewski, bardzo dziękujemy.
Grzegorz Górny and
Mocne
Michał
słowa na
Łuczewski,
koniec.
thank you very much.
Mocne
Very
podsumowanie,
powerful
bo właśnie te
words
owacje na
to
stojąco są
conclude our
największym i najlepszym
conference.
podziękowaniem. Podziękowaniem dla całego
Round of
zespołu, bo przecież to nie
applause
tylko dwaj panowie, to cały
is a
pani Ania, tak, to cały
word
zespół
of
wolontariuszy,
thank
ludzi bardzo
you
młodych, którzy się zaangażowali.
to
Podziękujmy im raz
just
jeszcze
the
brawami. Bardzo proszę,
speakers,
bo
but everybody, the
to dla mnie będzie duża
organizers,
nagroda.
the team of these young people who have
Ladies and
become
gentlemen,
involved
that's
in
the end of our
organizing
today's Congress.
this
Thank you for being
conference.
here, especially from faraway countries. That's the end. See you next time. Welcome to Poland. Szanowni Państwo, to wszystko. Jeszcze chciałbym raz jeszcze przypomnieć,
Ladies
że
and
jesteśmy tutaj
gentlemen,
dzięki Fundacji
thank you very
Polska
much.
Wielki
Let
Projekt,
me
to już
remind you
powiedziałem,
that we have
dzięki
gathered
partnerom
here
PKO BP,
thanks to the
Totalizatorowi Sportowemu,
Foundation Poland
Polskiej
Grand
Fundacji Narodowej,
Projekt,
firmie Taurun, Fundacji
and
Agencji
let
Rozwoju
me
Przemysłu,
thank our
Fundacji PGM i
partners,
Fundacji
PKO Bank
Orlen.
Polski,
Patroni
Totalizator
medialni to
Sportowy,
Telewizja
Polish
Polska, Radio
National
Kraków,
Foundation,
portal
Fundacja
IPL,
ARP,
portal w Polityce,
PGE,
portal Deliberacja.
Fundacja and Orlen, the
Goście
media
dzielne i
partners
wszystko,
are
co
Polish
najważniejsze.
Television,
Najważniejsze, żeby te
Kraków
dyskusje stąd
Radio
poszły dalej w świat razem z Państwem,
PL,
żebyśmy nie
w
czekali, tak
polityce,
jak mówił Grzegorz, tych
gość
500 lat,
niedzielny,
może uda
wszystko
się
co najważniejsze,
troszeczkę mniej ten okres
deliberacją.
skrócić dla dobra naszego i całego świata.
And
Dziękujemy.
hopefully
Dobrego,
the message
smacznego obiadu i do
goes to the
zobaczenia
world. Thank
na
you
szlaku
very
przy najbliższej
much
okazji.
and see you.